The skies were on the verge of splitting apart, and one individual's life was about to be transformed forever. Imagine this scene. A nation submerged in moral decay, where wealthy elites consumed the vulnerable, where religious leaders carried out meaningless ceremonies, while wrongdoing dominated the public squares. Then, without warning, a blinding encounter. A royal seat hanging in the space between the celestial realm and the earthly plane. Beings possessing 6 wings, shielding their own faces, proclaiming in both terror and adoration before a being so pure that even celestial messengers could not gaze upon him directly. The sacred building trembled. The very fabric of existence shuddered, and there was Isaiah, a human with contaminated speech, standing before the God who perceives all things. Who should I dispatch? The inquiry resonated across eternity. The events that followed would alter the fate of entire peoples. Isaiah was granted visions of occurrences yet to unfold, an unmarried woman giving birth to an infant named God among us, a tormented figure wounded for transgressions he never committed, a ruler whose dominion would have no conclusion, yet he would also witness devastation, treachery, and a population that would receive truth but select spiritual darkness instead. Monarchs would shake at his declarations, great powers would ascend and crumble precisely as he foretold. And many generations afterward, a woodworker from Nazareth would rise in a house of worship and proclaim, "This day, Isaiah's pronouncements have come to pass." What revelations did Isaiah receive that compelled him to accept an impossible assignment? Which prophetic utterances did he reveal that continue to impact our reality even now? The revelation is preparing to manifest, and nothing will ready you for what lies ahead. The year when King Uzziah passed away became a year the people of Judah could never erase from memory. For more than 50 years, this monarch had occupied the throne, shepherding the people through conflicts and periods of tranquility, through expansion and adversity. His time as ruler had been extensive, 52 years. To state it precisely, and for the majority of inhabitants dwelling in Judah, Uzziah represented the sole king they had experienced during their lifetimes. When his death occurred, the entire population experienced the void. Uncertainty filled the atmosphere. Who would guide them moving forward? What consequences would befall their success and stability? Isaiah numbered among those who carried the burden of this transitional moment. He was a young individual, likely in his 20s or perhaps early 30s, and he had matured during Uzziah's administration. Similar to countless others, he traveled to the temple to offer prayers, to pursue God's presence, possibly to discover some measure of clarity during this period of change. The temple located in Jerusalem served as the central point of the people's devotion, the location where God's manifest presence was believed to reside alongside his chosen ones. However, what transpired for Isaiah on that particular day defied all natural explanation. While he occupied space within the temple, something exceeding his most extreme expectations started to reveal itself. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1 informs us, "During the year when King Uzziah died, I witnessed the Lord positioned on a throne, elevated and exalted, and the flowing edge of his garment occupied the temple." Isaiah witnessed the Lord, not within a sleeping vision, not through his mental imagery, but through a revelation so tangible and so overwhelming that it would define him for all his remaining days. The Lord occupied a position on a throne, and this royal seat existed not at ground elevation. It stood high, raised above all other things. The trailing portion of God's robe occupied the temple. Consider that visual representation. A garment so immense that merely the dragging hem of it occupied the complete temple structure. Positioned above the throne, Isaiah observed creatures he had never previously encountered. These were seraphim, and the scriptures inform us that each possessed 6 wings. The designation seraphim itself signifies burning ones, suggesting entities of flame and overwhelming holiness. Each seraph employed its wings in a particular manner, Two wings veiled their faces, as though even these sanctified beings lacked the capacity to observe God directly. Two wings concealed their feet, demonstrating submission and deep respect. And using the final two wings, they maintained flight. These seraphim were not remaining motionless. They proclaimed to one another, their utterances forming a unified declaration that permeated the heavenly environment. Isaiah observed every aspect of this experience unfolding before him: the throne, the robe, the seraphim. Each component imprinted itself upon his consciousness. This was not a routine prayer session. This represented an encounter with the living God, the sovereign of the universe, the monarch surpassing all earthly monarchs. The seraphim that Isaiah witnessed were not simply hovering wordlessly around God's throne. They possessed a declaration, and they voiced it with sounds that caused everything surrounding them to quake. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 3 preserves what they proclaimed. Holy, holy, holy stands the Lord of hosts. The entire earth contains his glory. Observe that they uttered holy on 3 occasions. Within Hebrew tradition, repetition served as a method of highlighting something significant. When you restated it 3 consecutive times, you communicated it held the greatest importance conceivable. The seraphim were announcing that holiness represents the essence of God's identity. But what does holy genuinely signify? It indicates being separated, entirely distinct, pure in all dimensions. God embodies holiness because he exists unlike anything or anyone else within creation. No shadow exists in him, no imperfection, no defect. He is holiness personified. The seraphim additionally proclaimed, the entire earth contains his glory. God's glory represents his observable presence, his magnitude of significance, the revelation of his nature. And based on these heavenly messengers, this glory permeated the complete earth. The instant these declarations were voiced, something remarkable occurred. Verse 4 informs us, and the supports of the doorway trembled from the sound of the one who proclaimed, and the building became occupied with smoke. The physical construction of the temple responded to the worship. The doorway supports started to tremble. This represented a forceful shaking produced by the sound of worship. Subsequently, smoke occupied the temple. This was not common smoke. This represented the observable presence of God's glory, a dense cloud that manifested his holiness and sovereignty. The smoke permeated every space, creating difficulty for clear observation. The atmosphere became weighty, thick with divine manifestation. Isaiah stood in the center of everything, a mortal being who had wandered into something far exceeding mortal experience. The worship of the seraphim persisted. Holy, holy, holy reverberated throughout the environment. The doorway supports maintained their shaking. The smoke maintained its movement. This was not a mild, soothing experience. This was overpowering, nearly frightening. The holiness of God is not something that produces comfort. It is something that renders you conscious of your insignificance, how restricted your comprehension is, how enormous the separation is between the Creator and his created beings. Standing within that smoke-occupied temple, encircled by the worship of seraphim, listening to the reverberations of holy, holy, holy echoing throughout the environment, Isaiah abruptly grew conscious of something that filled him with dread. In the intense radiance of God's holiness, he perceived himself with clarity for the initial time, and what he perceived caused him to express his horror. The words erupted from his speech, documented in verse 5. Disaster to me, for I am ruined, because I am an individual of contaminated speech, and I reside in the center of a population of contaminated speech, for my vision has encountered the King, the Lord of hosts. The term disaster carried weight. It represented the variety of expression people employed when declaring calamity or demise. Isaiah was pronouncing this expression upon his own being. Disaster to me. He stated, I am ruined, which signifies I am destroyed or I am finished. Isaiah experienced the sensation of disintegrating. Why such an extreme response? Because he had just encountered absolute holiness, and within that encounter he comprehended how significantly he fell short. He particularly referenced his speech being contaminated. This carries importance because the mouth and speech represent the instruments we employ to express ourselves. Isaiah was acknowledging that his utterances had lacked purity. Perhaps he had engaged in spreading rumors. Perhaps he had spoken without consideration. Perhaps he had communicated things that were deceitful or harmful. Whatever the particular failures were, Isaiah understood that his communication had been tainted with wrongdoing. However, he did not conclude with merely himself. He stated, "I reside in the center of a population of contaminated speech." The complete nation of Judah experienced the identical condition. The population spoke deceptions, participated in gossip, and employed their words to damage others. Subsequently came the most concerning element. My vision has encountered the King, the Lord of hosts. Within the ancient comprehension, a conviction existed that no sinful individual could witness God and continue living. His holiness carried too much intensity for tainted mortal beings to endure. And at this moment, Isaiah had witnessed him. The contrast proved devastating. On one side existed God, holy, 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 flawless in all dimensions. On the opposing side existed Isaiah, sinful, fractured, contaminated. How could someone as tainted as Isaiah continue existing within the presence of someone as pure as God? Isaiah was not constructing justifications. He was perceiving himself within the radiance of God's holiness, and that radiance revealed everything. No location existed to conceal himself, no method to pretend. Isaiah had acknowledged his inadequacy. He stood persuaded that his conclusion had arrived. However, subsequently, something unanticipated occurred. One of the seraphim advanced toward Isaiah with intention, and within the seraph's grasp existed something that should have terrified Isaiah: a living coal, a burning fragment taken straight from the altar. The seraph had employed tongs to retrieve this coal because it carried too much heat for direct contact. This represented active fire, radiating with overwhelming heat, and it was approaching straight toward Isaiah's face. Verses 6 and 7 describe the occurrence. Subsequently, one of the seraphim traveled to me, possessing in his grasp a living coal, which he had removed with the tongs from the altar. And he made contact with my mouth using it, and stated, "Observe. This has made contact with your speech. Your wrongdoing is removed, and your transgression cleansed." The coal made contact with Isaiah's speech. The precise portion of his body that he had acknowledged was contaminated, now received contact from burning coal from God's altar. However, something miraculous was transpiring. The coal that should have burned Isaiah instead accomplished something completely different. The seraph proclaimed, "Observe, this has made contact with your speech. Your wrongdoing is removed, and your transgression cleansed." Isaiah's offense was eliminated, vanished. The term cleansed signifies purified thoroughly, like washing something until no evidence of contamination persists. The altar within the temple represented the location where offerings were presented, where the blood of creatures was provided to address wrongdoing. And at this moment, a coal from that precise altar was making contact with Isaiah, demonstrating that his transgression was receiving treatment based on God's arrangement. This represented pure grace. Isaiah had not purified himself. He had not executed a ceremony to render himself acceptable. He had merely stood present, broken, and conscious of his transgression, and God had supplied the purification. The seraph did not state, "Attempt greater effort subsequently." The communication was instantaneous and thorough. Your wrongdoing is removed and your transgression cleansed. Completed tense. Accomplished. Concluded. Fire within the scriptures frequently signifies purification. When metal craftsmen desire to purify gold, they elevate it to extreme heat levels. The impurities ascend to the upper layer and can be extracted, departing pure metal remaining. And at this moment, Isaiah was experiencing spiritual purification. Following this moment, Isaiah was fundamentally altered. The offense that had overwhelmed him had vanished. The transgression that had created separation from God was eliminated. He had been converted from someone who was ruined into someone who was purified and acceptable before a holy God. With his transgression cleansed and his offense eliminated, Isaiah occupied a thoroughly different position. The smoke continued occupying the temple. The seraphim continued worshipping. God's presence continued surrounding everything. However, Isaiah was no longer ruined. He was purified, cleansed, and prepared. And that represents when God communicated. Verse 8 documents what transpired. Additionally, I perceived the sound of the Lord stating, "Who should I dispatch, and who will travel for us?" This was not a directive. This represented an invitation, an inquiry, an occasion for someone to offer themselves. God was pursuing a messenger. Observe that God stated us, "Who will travel for us?" This plural indication suggests the complex character of God's existence. What proves remarkable is the sequence. God did not pose this inquiry before Isaiah's cleansing. He did not summon a contaminated individual to assist him. The summons arrived following the purification. Initially came grace, subsequently came the summons to assistance, and Isaiah's response, instantaneous. He stated, "I am present. Dispatch me." 6 straightforward expressions, yet they possess tremendous significance. Isaiah was offering himself for something he did not yet completely comprehend. He lacked knowledge of the specifics. He lacked knowledge of the duration. However, he stated yes, regardless. I am present signifies I am available, I am accessible, I am prepared. And dispatch me signifies I am agreeable to travel wherever you desire, agreeable to accomplish whatever you desire. It represented complete surrender, absolute availability, total willingness. This represents the natural response of someone who has genuinely encountered God's grace. When you comprehend what God has accomplished for you, when you acknowledge that He has removed your transgression and rendered you purified, assisting Him transforms into a delight, not an obligation. Consider the conversion. Isaiah had approached the temple as a regular individual. He had witnessed God and expressed, "Disaster to me." He had received cleansing by the coal from the altar, and at this moment he was offering himself for divine assistance. That represents the power of God's grace. God had posed an inquiry, and Isaiah had provided a response. This represented a prophetic assignment, a divine summons, an appointment that would influence everything Isaiah would accomplish for all his subsequent days. He existed now as a prophet, a representative for God, a messenger who would transport divine declarations to the population. Isaiah had offered himself with passion. However, God was not going to conceal the character of the assignment. What arrived subsequently was grave. Verses 9 and 10 contain some of the most challenging declarations any prophet ever received. And he stated, "Proceed and inform this population. Persist in listening, yet do not comprehend. Persist in observing, yet do not recognize. Render the consciousness of this population insensitive and their hearing capacity diminished and close their vision. Otherwise, they might observe with their vision and listen with their hearing capacity and comprehend with their consciousness and turn back and receive restoration." God was informing Isaiah that the population would listen to his communications but would not comprehend them. They would observe the indications but would not recognize their significance. This was not going to represent a service of widespread transformations. This represented communicating truth to individuals who would dismiss it. The difficulty was not that Isaiah would represent a weak communicator. The matter existed with the population's inner being. They had grown hardened, resistant, unwilling to respond to God's truth. God described their state vividly. Their inner being would be insensitive, calloused, unresponsive, non-reactive. Their hearing capacity would be diminished. Spiritually reluctant to listen, their vision would be closed, intentionally sealed to truth. This concerned spiritual obstinacy. The population possessed the ability to comprehend, yet they lacked desire to. They could listen, yet they selected not to. This had to represent discouraging information. God was fundamentally informing Isaiah, "You are going to declare, and individuals will not listen. You are going to alert them, and they will not transform." However, this discloses something essential. Success is not quantified by the number of individuals responding favorably. Success is quantified by dedication to what God has summoned you to accomplish. Isaiah's responsibility was to communicate what God instructed him to communicate, irrespective of how individuals responded. This additionally reveals God's fairness. He would not execute judgment on the population without initially alerting them. Although he understood they would dismiss the declaration, he continued dispatching a prophet. Every individual would possess the occasion to listen and turn back. Isaiah at this moment comprehended the assignment. It would not be prestigious. It would not render him favored, yet it represented what God had summoned him to accomplish. Following hearing regarding the dismissal he would encounter, Isaiah posed a natural inquiry. How extended would this circumstance persist? When would things alter? Verse 11 documents it. Subsequently, I stated, "Lord, for what duration?" God's response was not reassuring. Until the settlements are devastated and lacking occupants, the residences are lacking a person, the territory is completely barren. The Lord has transported people distant away, and the abandoned locations are numerous in the center of the territory. The hardness would not conclude with revival. It would conclude with devastation. The settlements would receive destruction, departed empty. The residences would remain unoccupied. The territory would transform into a wasteland. God would transport the population distant away into captivity. This represented the consequence of persistent rebellion. When individuals persistently dismiss God's alerts, judgment ultimately arrives. However, verse 13 contains optimism. Yet still a 10th portion will exist in it, and will turn back and exist for destruction, as a terebinth tree or as an oak whose remaining base persists when it receives cutting down. The holy descendants shall represent its remaining base. A small surviving group would persist. Similar to a tree base that contains capacity for new development, this surviving group would maintain God's intentions. They would represent the holy descendants. Isaiah's inquiry regarding duration received a grave response. This would extend his complete lifetime and farther. Isaiah would invest decades communicating to individuals who predominantly would not listen. And still, he would have to persist faithfully, believing that God understood what he was accomplishing. To comprehend why Isaiah's assignment would prove so challenging, we must examine Judah's spiritual state. On the exterior layer, everything appeared favorable. King Uzziah's administration had delivered success and military power. However, underneath this successful exterior layer, something existed profoundly incorrect. The population had preserved their religious activities, yet their inner beings had drifted distant from God. Their devotion had transformed into hollow ceremony. They believed they could satisfy God with external observances while existing however they desired. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 15, demonstrates how God perceived their religious practice. "For what intention is the abundance of your offerings to me? I have received sufficiency of burnt presentations. Deliver no additional pointless offerings. Incense represents an offense to me." God was dismissing their devotion because they were employing religious practice as a concealment for evil. They would present offerings and subsequently mistreat the vulnerable. They would recognize the Sabbath and subsequently deceive in commercial transactions. The prosperous had grown particularly dishonest. They employed their authority to exploit those who lacked the ability to protect themselves. Those without husbands and those without parents received exploitation. Legal proceedings were occupied with corruption. The vulnerable possessed no prospect of equitable treatment. Isaiah chapter 5 describes how the wealthy were acquiring property, establishing monopolies, gathering resources. Meanwhile, individuals pursued satisfaction without limitation, celebrating while disregarding God. Worship of false gods had additionally infiltrated. Although they claimed to worship the God of Israel, they incorporated pagan activities. They consulted mediums and spirit practitioners. Their faith had transformed into a mixture. The authorities were especially responsible. Rather than directing individuals toward righteousness, they guided them deeper into wrongdoing. Deceptive prophets assured harmony when harmony did not exist. This represented the Judah that Isaiah received summons to confront. These represented the individuals who would listen to his alerts and disregard them. Isaiah would invest his complete service, attempting to awaken a population determined to remain unconscious throughout its own devastation. Isaiah's service did not commence with mild encouragement or comfortable declarations. From the precise beginning, God directed him to address the disturbing reality of what Judah had transformed into. The population might have appeared successful on the exterior, yet inside it was decaying with unfairness and dishonesty. The prosperous leadership had grown acquisitive beyond measure. Isaiah chapter 5 verse 8 describes their conduct. Disaster to those who connect residence to residence. They attach property to property until no location exists where they might reside alone in the center of the territory. These wealthy landholders were not satisfied with what they possessed. They maintained acquiring additional property, attaching one residence to another, linking one property to the subsequent, expanding their holdings until nothing remained for anyone else. This was not merely intelligent commerce, this represented oppression. Small cultivators who had labored their territory for successive generations received displacement. Families who had received modest portions from their ancestors were losing everything. The prosperous were establishing monopolies, gathering all the assets in decreasing numbers of individuals, departing ordinary individuals with no location to reside and no method to sustain themselves. The territory that God had provided to Israel was intended to receive distribution equitably among the tribes and families. However, at this moment, the powerful were consuming everything, treating territory like a commodity to accumulate rather than a provision from God to receive sharing. They constructed their large residences and expanded their cultivation while forcing the vulnerable into desperate poverty. The complete justice structure had disintegrated. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 23 reveals the difficulty. Your leaders are defiant and associates of criminals. Everyone values corruption and pursues compensation. They do not protect those without fathers. Neither does the situation of those without husbands appear before them. The precise individuals who were intended to shield the defenseless had transformed into their attackers. Decision-makers who should have remained impartial were receiving corruption. If you possessed resources, you could acquire a beneficial determination. If you existed as vulnerable, you possessed no possibility of fairness. The legal proceedings that were intended to represent locations of equity had transformed into commercial centers where fairness received sale to the highest purchaser. Those without husbands and those without parents represented the most defenseless participants of society. In ancient Israel, a female lacking a spouse and offspring lacking a parent possessed no individual to supply for them or shield them. God's instructions particularly directed his population to provide for these helpless individuals. However, rather than shielding them, the authorities were exploiting them, refusing them fairness, stealing from them. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, captures God's displeasure. Disaster to those who establish unrighteous establishments, who document misfortune, which they have ordered to steal from the desperate of fairness, and to remove what is correct from the vulnerable of my population. that those without husbands might represent their victims, and that they might steal from those without fathers. The authorities were genuinely documenting regulations designed to oppress individuals. They were establishing legal structures that provided them authorization to steal from the vulnerable. Meanwhile, these identical dishonest authorities were intensely religious, at minimum on the exterior layer. They appeared at the temple consistently. They presented the demanded offerings. They recognized the celebrations. From the exterior, they appeared like devoted followers of God. However, their devotion was thoroughly hollow because their existences were occupied with evil. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 13 through 15 documents God's response. Deliver no additional pointless offerings. Incense represents an offense to me. The new lunar cycles, the Sabbaths, and the summoning of gatherings, I cannot tolerate wrongdoing and the sacred assembly. Your new lunar cycles and your designated celebrations my being despises. They represent difficulty to me. I am exhausted of enduring them. When you extend your hands, I will conceal my vision from you. Although you create numerous prayers, I will not listen. Your hands contain blood. God was dismissing their devotion. Every offering they delivered, every prayer they presented, all of it was repulsive to him. Why? Because you cannot worship God within the temple and subsequently oppress individuals in the commercial area? You cannot sing adorations on the Sabbath and subsequently deceive the vulnerable on the following day. You cannot claim to value God while crushing his offspring beneath your control. The population believed their religious ceremonies would conceal their transgressions. They believed as extended as they preserved the observances, God would disregard their unfairness. However, God perceived completely through it. Their hands contained blood, the blood of the innocent individuals they had exploited and destroyed. Isaiah chapter 3 verses 14 and 15 demonstrate God's confrontation. The Lord will approach into judgment with the leadership of his population and his leaders, for you have consumed the vineyard. The stolen goods of the vulnerable exist in your residences. What do you intend by crushing my population and grinding the faces of the vulnerable, states the Lord God of hosts. God was maintaining them responsible. They had consumed what belonged to the vulnerable. They had stolen and accumulated. They had crushed individuals, grinding them downward without compassion. This represented the social reality that Isaiah had to confront. A society where the wealthy acquired greater prosperity by stealing from the vulnerable, where fairness received sale, where the defenseless possessed no protection, where religious practice and evil existed simultaneously as though no contradiction existed. Years into Isaiah's service, a significant crisis erupted that jeopardized the precise survival of Judah, and their strategy represented nothing less than leadership transformation. The two authorities were Rezin, who governed over Aram from Damascus, and Pekah, the descendant of Remaliah, who had seized the throne of Israel, the northern nation. These two populations shared a mutual difficulty. The Assyrian Empire was expanding toward the west, conquering territory and demanding tribute payments. Rezin and Pekah determined their optimal possibility of survival, represented forming a coalition to oppose Assyria together. However, King Ahaz of Judah declined to participate in their alliance. Perhaps Ahaz lacked trust in them. Perhaps he believed he could establish a separate arrangement with Assyria. Whatever his motivations, Ahaz stated no to the coalition. Rezin and Pekah experienced displeasure regarding this. They determined that if Ahaz would not participate willingly, they would compel him outward and substitute him with someone who would cooperate. Consequently, they established a military alliance and prepared to advance against Jerusalem. Isaiah chapter 7 verses 1 and 2 describe what transpired. At this moment it occurred during the days of Ahaz, the descendant of Jotham, the descendant of Uzziah, monarch of Judah, that Rezin, monarch of Syria, and Pekah, the descendant of Remaliah, monarch of Israel, advanced upward to Jerusalem to create conflict against it, yet could not succeed against it. and it received communication to the family of David, stating, "Syria's military forces are positioned in Ephraim." Consequently, his consciousness and the consciousness of his population were affected, as the trees of the woodland are affected with the atmospheric current. The armies advanced toward Jerusalem. They could not capture the settlement in their initial attempt, yet they were situated nearby, and everyone understood they would attempt again. When the information arrived at King Ahaz, panic commenced. The text states their consciousnesses were affected, as the trees of the woodland are affected with the atmospheric current. Envision a woodland during a violent atmospheric disturbance, with every tree bending and moving. That represents how the monarch and the population were responding. Absolute fear, thorough panic, and honestly, they possessed justification to experience concern. Ahaz was encountering a two-direction attack from experienced military authorities. Together, these two armies signified a genuine danger. However, the circumstance existed even more severe. Verse 6 discloses the complete conspiracy. We should advance upward against Judah and disturb it, and we should create an opening in its barrier for ourselves and establish a monarch over them, the descendant of Tabeel. They were not merely strategizing to overcome Judah in conflict. They were strategizing to eliminate Ahaz from the throne and install their personal controlled monarch. This represented a direct attack on the lineage of David. God had assured that David's descendants would occupy on the throne of Judah. If Rezin and Pekah succeeded, they would not merely be altering political authority, they would be interrupting God's redemptive strategy. The importance could not have existed higher. Ahaz was youthful and lacking experience. His parent had recently died, and he had only recently accepted the throne. At this moment, he was encountering the largest crisis of his existence, and he was terrified. Everyone was inquiring, "What are we going to accomplish?" Ahaz examined the circumstance from a purely mortal perspective. Two armies against one. Without assistance, Judah would probably collapse. Consequently, he commenced considering his alternatives, and one authority existed powerful sufficiently to address Aram and Israel, Assyria. If Ahaz could acquire Assyria on his direction, Aram and Israel would not possess opportunity. It appeared like the intelligent political action, the rational solution. However, another alternative existed that Ahaz was not genuinely considering: trusting God. Judah represented God's selected population. Jerusalem represented the settlement where God had positioned his designation, and God had created assurances to David's family regarding their throne persisting eternally. Rather, Ahaz was creating political calculations. His consciousness was shaking, similar to trees, in an atmospheric disturbance, because he was examining the difficulty through mortal vision solely. He perceived the armies, yet did not perceive the God who directs the armies. While King Ahaz was absorbed with fear, God determined to intervene. He dispatched Isaiah straight to the monarch with particular instructions regarding where to encounter him. Isaiah chapter 7 verse 3 documents God's directive. Subsequently, the Lord stated to Isaiah, "Proceed outward at this moment to encounter Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your descendant, at the conclusion of the channel of the upper reservoir on the roadway to the fuller's territory." This represented a precise location. The channel represented a portion of Jerusalem's water structure. The roadway to the fuller's territory represented where individuals transported their garments to receive washing. Why would Ahaz exist present? Most probably, he was examining the settlement's water provision. When preparing for an encirclement, water is essential. If an adversary encircles your settlement and eliminates exterior water sources, you require sufficient water preserved inside to continue existing. Ahaz was likely examining the infrastructure, strategizing for the most severe outcome. God instructed Isaiah to transport his descendant accompanying. Shear-Jashub was not a common designation. It represented a prophetic designation signifying a surviving group shall turn back. Every occasion someone stated the youth's designation, they were creating a prophecy. Even within judgment, God would maintain a surviving group. Consequently, Isaiah and his descendant traveled to where Ahaz was laboring. And into this scene of concerned strategizing, the prophet arrived with a declaration from God. Verse 4 contains the central declaration, "And communicate to him, pay attention, and remain calm. Do not experience fear or lose courage for these two remaining portions of burning sticks, for the intense displeasure of Rezin and Syria and the descendant of Remaliah." Examine the expression, pay attention and remain calm. Cease panicking. Cease moving around in fear. Pay attention and settle down. Do not experience fear or lose courage. This represented a straight directive. Fear represented natural. However, God was instructing Ahaz not to surrender into it. Subsequently arrived the brilliant comparison. These two remaining portions of burning sticks, Rezin and Pekah, who appeared so dangerous, represented nothing except burning remaining portions in God's vision. A burning stick represents a flaming piece. However, these were not even proper burning sticks any longer. They represented remaining portions, nearly consumed completely, merely creating smoke remnants. They appeared dangerous, yet they possessed no genuine authority remaining. Observe that God did not even concern himself to state Pekah's designation. He merely called him the descendant of Remaliah, as though he was not significant sufficiently to identify. These monarchs who appeared so powerful to Ahaz were barely deserving of mentioning in God's perspective. Verses 5 through 7 explain the conspiracy, because Syria, Ephraim, and the descendant of Remaliah have strategized evil against you, stating, "We should advance upward against Judah and disturb it, and we should create an opening in its barrier for ourselves, and establish a monarch over them, the descendant of Tabeel. Thus states the Lord God, it shall not remain, neither shall it occur." God acknowledged the strategy. Yes, they were conspiring. Yes, they desired to penetrate through the barriers. Yes, they strategized to overthrow Ahaz. However, God's determination was straightforward and absolute. It shall not remain, neither shall it occur. This was not a forecast based on military examination. This represented God announcing what would and would not transpire. The conspiracy would collapse, not because Judah was powerful, but because God had determined it would not transpire. The declaration was unmistakable. Ahaz did not require to fear. He did not require to panic or create desperate arrangements. All he required to accomplish was trust God and remain calm. The danger that appeared so overpowering represented nothing to God. Isaiah was not concluded. Following informing Ahaz not to fear, he explained why the conspiracy would collapse and what would transpire to the dangerous nations. Verse 8 commences, "For the leadership of Syria is Damascus, and the leadership of Damascus is Rezin." God was creating a statement regarding restricted authority. Rezin directed Damascus, and Damascus directed Aram. That represented it. He did not direct Judah. He did not direct God's strategies. Subsequently, God attached a time indication. Within 65 years, Ephraim will receive breaking so that it will not represent a population. Ephraim represented another designation for Israel. God was stating that within 65 years, Israel would cease existing as a population. This assured Ahaz that the northern nation endangering him at this moment would ultimately receive elimination thoroughly. Verse 9 persists. "The leadership of Ephraim is Samaria, and the leadership of Samaria is Remaliah's descendant." Again, God was highlighting restricted jurisdiction. Pekah directed Samaria, and that represented it. Subsequently arrived one of the most significant statements. "If you will not accept as true, certainly you shall not receive establishment." This represented the solution. God was providing protection, yet it arrived with a requirement: trust. Ahaz had to genuinely accept God's assurance as true. If he did not accept as true, if he depended on his personal schemes rather, he would not receive establishment. His administration, his lineage, his nation would not persist. This represented a straight challenge. God was stating, I am providing you thorough security. I am assuring you these adversaries will collapse, yet you have to trust me. Your political continuation is linked straight to your trust. The Hebrew expression interaction is powerful. If you do not remain firm in me, you will not remain firm whatsoever. If you are not secure in your trust, you will not be secure in your throne. For Ahaz, this signified he possessed a selection. He could trust God's assurance, or he could trust his personal political instincts and create an alliance with Assyria. He could remain firm in trust, or he could depend on mortal authority. One direction guided to security, the other guided to devastation. God was providing thorough protection without any military alliance, without tribute compensations, without complicated negotiations. All Ahaz had to accomplish was accept as true. However, as we will observe, Ahaz was already inclining toward trusting Assyria rather. Following delivering the declaration regarding not fearing, Isaiah received another expression from God for Ahaz. This occasion, God was going to create an exceptional provision. Isaiah chapter 7, verses 10 and 11 document what transpired. Furthermore, the Lord communicated again to Ahaz, stating, request an indication for yourself from the Lord your God. Request it either in the depth or in the elevation above. This was remarkable. God was inviting Ahaz to request any indication he desired. Any indication whatsoever, as deep as the burial location or as elevated as the celestial regions. Consider what this signified. Ahaz could have requested anything. He could have stated, cause the solar body to remain motionless. He could have requested an earth tremor, flame from the celestial regions, the instantaneous demise of his adversaries. Any miraculous event, any extraordinary occurrence, God was providing to supply it. Why would God create such a provision? Because he desired Ahaz to trust him. God understood that Ahaz was hesitating, contemplating creating an arrangement with Assyria. Consequently, God was proceeding above and farther, providing to supply whatever evidence Ahaz required. It represented an action of exceptional grace. However, Ahaz's response disclosed what was genuinely in his consciousness. Verse 12 documents what he stated. However, Ahaz stated, I will not request, neither will I evaluate the Lord. On the exterior layer, this sounds devoted. Ahaz was referencing a principle from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. He was creating it sound as though he was being suitably humble, yet this represented thoroughly false humility. God himself had just invited Ahaz to request an indication. When God provides to demonstrate himself, it is not evaluating him to receive that provision. Ahaz was employing religious expression to conceal his disbelief. He was employing a scripture passage as a justification to dismiss God's assistance. Why would Ahaz decline? Because he had already created his determination. He had already determined to dispatch messengers to Assyria. He had already selected to trust in political alliances rather than divine assurances. Requesting God for an indication would have obligated him to trust God, and that is not what he desired. This represents why Isaiah's response in verse 13 is so direct. Subsequently, he stated, listen, at this moment, O family of David, is it an insignificant matter for you to exhaust people? Yet will you exhaust my God additionally? Isaiah was experiencing frustration, and God was experiencing frustration. Ahaz was not merely dismissing the indication, he was dismissing God himself. Observe that Isaiah addressed him as family of David. This represented a reminder of who Ahaz was intended to represent, a descendant of David, the monarch who trusted God even when encountering Goliath. However, Ahaz represented nothing similar to him. The phrase, exhaust my God, is striking. How do you exhaust God? By declining his grace, by dismissing his assistance when he provides it, by employing spiritual expression to conceal a consciousness that does not trust him. This moment disclosed the genuine condition of Ahaz's consciousness. He was not interested in what God desired. He was not agreeable to travel by trust. He desired to trust in what he could observe and direct. Ahaz had declined to request an indication, yet God was going to provide one regardless. Since the monarch would not request, God would supply his personal indication, one that would prove far more significant than anything Ahaz could have envisioned. Verse 14 contains one of the most recognized prophecies in the scriptures. Consequently, the Lord himself will provide you an indication. Observe, the unmarried woman shall conceive and deliver a descendant, and shall designate his name Emmanuel. This was not merely any indication. This represented the Lord himself supplying confirmation. The indication involved an unmarried woman conceiving and delivering a descendant. The Hebrew expression alma indicates a youthful female of marriage-appropriate age who is unmarried. This was not discussing a female who was already married. This was discussing an unmarried woman, someone who would conceive in a manner that challenged natural explanation. The offspring would receive designation Emmanuel, signifying God among us. This designation was itself a declaration. God was not removed or unconcerned. He existed among them. Even when they dismissed him, God persisted, present, engaged, dedicated to his intentions. This prophecy possessed layers. In the instantaneous situation, a youthful female probably existed who would soon possess a descendant, and this offspring would function as a time indicator. However, the expression indicated to something far greater, a future unmarried birth that would deliver the ultimate Emmanuel. Verses 15 and 16 provide the instantaneous application. Dairy products and sweet substance he shall consume, that he might understand to decline the evil and select the beneficial. For before the offspring shall understand to decline the evil and select the beneficial, the territory that you experience concern will receive abandonment by both her monarchs. Before this offspring reached the age where he could create moral determinations, likely around age 2 or 3, the danger would conclude. Both Rezin and Pekah would vanish. This represented God's timeline. Within a limited number of years, the crisis would receive resolution. However, Ahaz did not accept it as true. He had already dismissed God's provision. Consequently, although God graciously supplied this prophecy, Ahaz was going to disregard it and accomplish things his personal method. The designation, Emmanuel, God among us, should have represented a reassurance. Regardless of what they encountered, God existed among them. However, to receive the advantage of God among us, you have to genuinely accept as true that God exists among you. Because Ahaz dismissed God's protection and selected to trust Assyria rather, Isaiah had to deliver another prophecy, this one considerably darker. God was going to permit Ahaz to possess what he desired, and he would discover it was not what he believed. Verse 17 contains the threatening announcement, "The Lord will deliver the monarch of Assyria upon you and your population and your parents' residence." Days that have not arrived since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah. Ahaz desired Assyrian assistance. He would acquire the Assyrians, yet they would not arrive as assistants. They would arrive as conquerors. Verses 18 through 20 paint a vivid representation. "And it shall occur during that day that the Lord will whistle for the flying insect that exists in the most distant portion of the waterways of Egypt, and for the stinging insect that exists in the territory of Assyria. They will arrive, and all of them will settle in the barren valleys, and in the rock formations, and on all thorny vegetation, and in all grazing areas. During the identical day, the Lord will remove hair with a compensated blade, with those from beyond the waterway, with the monarch of Assyria, the head covering and the hair of the lower limbs, and will additionally eliminate the facial hair. God would whistle for Assyria, similar to summoning a domestic animal. The Assyrian military would occupy similar to stinging insects, covering everything, and God would employ Assyria similar to a blade to humiliate Judah. Removing hair from the head covering, lower limbs and facial area represented thorough shame. Ahaz believed he was compensating Assyria to shield him. However, God was permitting Assyria to humiliate Judah. The territory would receive devastation. Valuable grape cultivation would transform into overgrown with thorny vegetation. Individuals would continue existing by preserving merely a couple of creatures. This represented the result of trusting Assyria rather than God. God provided Isaiah yet another indication to reveal what was preparing to transpire. This occasion, it represented a living indication in the form of Isaiah's personal descendant. Isaiah chapter 8, verses 1 through 4 describe what transpired. Furthermore, the Lord stated to me, "Receive a large document and inscribe on it with a person's writing instrument concerning Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And I will receive for myself dedicated witnesses to document Uriah the religious leader and Zechariah the descendant of Jeberechiah." Subsequently, I traveled to the female prophet, and she conceived and delivered a descendant. Subsequently, the Lord stated to me, "Designate his name Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. For before the offspring shall possess understanding to proclaim, my parent and my mother, the prosperity of Damascus and the stolen goods of Samaria will receive removal before the monarch of Assyria." God instructed Isaiah to inscribe downward a designation on a public document with witnesses. The designation was Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, signifying accelerate the stolen goods, hasten the plunder. Subsequently, Isaiah's spouse became expectant and provided birth to a descendant with this prophetic designation. The significance was unmistakable. Plunder is arriving rapidly. Before this infant could even communicate his initial expressions, the prosperity of Damascus and Samaria would receive transportation off by Assyria. The two settlements endangering Judah would receive conquest. The danger would receive elimination precisely as God had assured. This offspring's designation represented a daily proclamation. Every occasion someone stated Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, they were prophesying the overcome of Rezin and Pekah. The youth represented a traveling reminder that God's expression would arrive genuine. Historical documentation confirms this prophecy received fulfillment. Within a couple of years, Assyria conquered Damascus and eliminated Rezin. Shortly following, Pekah received assassination. Everything transpired precisely as God stated it would. The crisis resolved itself exactly as God assured, not because of Ahaz's political maneuvering, but because God had announced it. Despite all the judgment Isaiah had to proclaim, despite all the alerts regarding devastation and captivity, God did not depart his population without optimism. Woven throughout Isaiah's prophecies existed glimpses of something beautiful, something that would arrive following the darkness. And one of the most powerful representations Isaiah received represented the assurance of illumination penetrating into darkness. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 2 contains this remarkable prophecy. The population who traveled in darkness have witnessed a great illumination. Those who resided in the territory of the shadow of demise, upon them an illumination has radiated. This was not discussing a small flame or a dim light source. This represented a great illumination, powerful sufficiently to penetrate through the deepest darkness, bright sufficiently to convert everything it made contact with. The population Isaiah was describing were traveling in darkness, not merely experiencing a temporary absence of light, but existing in ongoing darkness, stumbling through existence without direction or optimism. They were residing in the territory of the shadow of demise. A phrase that captures the sensation of existing close to demise, existing under its persistent danger, encircled by despair and hopelessness. However, into this bleak circumstance, illumination would radiate, not gradually, not dimly, yet powerfully and abruptly. The illumination would arrive to them. They would not have to pursue it or acquire it. It would merely radiate upon them, converting their complete experience. Verse 3 persists. You have increased the population and expanded its delight. They celebrate before you based on the delight of gathering, as individuals celebrate when they separate the stolen goods. The arrival of this illumination would deliver multiplication and delight. The population that appeared to be contracting and dying would abruptly develop. The individuals who had been expressing sorrow would discover justifications to celebrate. The passage provides two comparisons to assist us comprehend the variety of delight this would represent. Initially, it would resemble the delight of gathering. Consider cultivators who have labored all season, planting seeds, attending crops, observing and anticipating. Subsequently arrives gathering time when all that labor compensates off. The storage buildings are occupied. Abundance exists. The difficult labor succeeded. That represents pure, deep, satisfying delight. Secondarily, it would resemble the delight of combatants separating plunder following a victory. When soldiers triumph in a conflict and acquire to distribute the gains of combat, excitement, relief, and celebration exist. They continued existing. They triumphed. At this moment, they acquire to appreciate the compensations. That represents the variety of delight this illumination would deliver. This prophecy was indicating to something particular. Isaiah was perceiving into the future to a time when someone would arrive who would represent the illumination of the reality, someone who would radiate into the deepest darkness of mortal wrongdoing and demise, someone who would deliver delight similar to gathering and victory combined. The population did not comprehend the complete significance when Isaiah initially communicated these expressions. However, he was painting a representation of the Messiah who would one day arrive. The illumination that received assurance would not merely deliver emotional reassurance or spiritual enlightenment. It would deliver genuine, concrete deliverance from genuine oppression. Isaiah's prophecy persisted with representations of physical liberation. Verse 4 describes what would transpire. For you have fractured the burden of his weight and the supporting piece of his shoulder portion, the controlling instrument of his oppressor. As during the day of Midian, God was going to fracture the instruments of oppression. The burden represented what they positioned on creatures to cause them to labor, a symbol of receiving compulsion into work, of possessing no liberty. The supporting piece on the shoulder portion represented the weight individuals had to transport, the mass pressing downward on them. The controlling instrument of the oppressor represented the weapon employed to strike and direct individuals. All of these would receive fracturing, not loosening, not rendered lighter, yet thoroughly fractured and destroyed. And the comparison Isaiah employed was significant. Quote, as during the day of Midian. This indicated backward to a narrative in Israel's historical documentation discovered in the Book of Decision Makers, when Gideon and a small military overcame the vast Midianite powers. It represented a conflict where God demonstrated his authority in an unmistakable manner. The victory did not arrive through superior quantities or improved weapons. It arrived through God's supernatural intervention. Isaiah was stating that the deliverance from oppression would resemble that. It would not receive accomplishment through normal mortal methods. It would represent a divine action, a miraculous fracturing of restraints, a supernatural liberation. Verse 5 attaches another powerful representation. For every boot covering of the advancing combatant in conflict, commotion, and garments rolled in blood will receive employment for burning and fuel substance of flame. The boot covering soldiers wore as they advanced into conflict, the uniforms marked with blood from combat. All of it would receive burning upward. This represented a representation of combat concluding. When you do not require military boot coverings any longer, when blood-marked conflict equipment is merely fuel substance for flame, it signifies harmony has arrived. The Messiah would not merely deliver illumination. He would deliver the conclusion of oppression. He would fracture every burden. He would destroy the weapons employed against God's population. He would deliver such thorough harmony that instruments of combat would transform into obsolete, beneficial solely for burning. This represented the variety of deliverance Isaiah was assuring. Subsequently, Isaiah created one of the most recognized announcements in all of Scripture. He explained how this illumination would arrive, how this deliverance would transpire. It would all center on a birth, a particularly special offspring who would receive birth into the reality. Verse 6 commences, "For to us an offspring is delivered, to us a descendant is provided." Observe the two distinct phrases. An offspring is delivered communicates of his mortality. He would approach the reality the manner every mortal does, through birth. He would represent a genuine offspring, a genuine mortal being delivered in a particular time and location. However, a descendant is provided communicates of something else. This was not merely any offspring receiving birth. This represented a provision from God, a descendant provided from the celestial realm to the earthly realm. The passage persists. "And the governing authority will exist upon his shoulder portion." This offspring would not persist as a helpless infant. He would develop to transport the mass of authority, governing authority, the jurisdiction to govern, the responsibility to guide, the authority to create determinations would settle on his shoulder portions. He would represent a monarch, yet not merely any monarch. He would transport governmental jurisdiction in a manner that would exceed all earthly governors. This was exceptional. Isaiah was prophesying regarding an offspring who would represent both mortal and divine, both delivered and provided, both an infant and a governor. The prophecy maintained tensions that would not create thorough meaning until many generations afterward, when this offspring would genuinely arrive. However, Isaiah was dedicated to document what God demonstrated him. Although the complete representation was not yet unmistakable, Isaiah did not conclude with merely announcing the offspring's birth. He proceeded to enumerate the designations this arriving governor would transport. And these designations are unlike any ever provided to a mortal monarch. The passage persists, "And his designation will receive designation, Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." 4 designations, or potentially 5 based on how you separate them, each disclosing something fundamental regarding who this offspring would represent. Wonderful Counselor, or Wonderful Counselor, communicates of his comprehension. He would provide counsel that was wonderful, exceeding normal mortal comprehension, occupied with insight that could solely arrive from divine understanding. When you require direction, when you encounter determinations, when you lack understanding what to accomplish, this monarch would supply comprehension that was genuinely wonderful. Mighty God represents a shocking title. This was not merely stating the monarch would represent powerful or that he would signify God. This was designating the offspring himself, Mighty God. He would possess divine authority. He would represent God in the physical form. For Isaiah to state this regarding an arriving offspring was remarkable. No ordinary mortal monarch could ever receive designation Mighty God without it representing blasphemy. However, Isaiah was prophesying regarding someone who would genuinely represent God, while additionally representing genuinely mortal, Everlasting Father, communicates of his provision and his eternity. A parent shields, supplies, nurtures, and values his offspring. This monarch would resemble a parent to his population, yet an everlasting individual, never dying, never abandoning, never collapsing in his provision. He would reveal the flawless parental affection that persists eternally. Prince of Peace describes both his nature and his administration. He would not represent a combatant monarch who governed through violence. He would represent a harmony deliverer, establishing accord, concluding conflicts, establishing wholeness. Where he governed, harmony would dominate. These 4 designations together painted a representation of someone who was thoroughly divine and would govern flawlessly. No mortal monarch in Israel's historical documentation ever existed upward to these titles. However, Isaiah was perceiving someone in the future who would accomplish every single individual of them. Isaiah's prophecy regarding this arriving offspring monarch persisted with specifics regarding his nation. This would not represent merely another lineage that would ultimately collapse similar to all the others. This would represent something eternal. Verse 7 announces, "Of the expansion of his governing authority and harmony, no conclusion will exist. Most nations ultimately cease developing. They arrive at their peak and subsequently decline. However, this nation would prove distinct. It would maintain expanding, the governing authority would maintain increasing, the harmony would maintain distributing. No conclusion would exist to it. Not because it would level off at maximum dimension, yet because it would persistently develop eternally." The passage persists. "Upon the throne of David and over his nation, to arrange it and establish it with judgment and fairness, from that time advancing, even eternally." This linked the prophecy to God's assurance to David. Many generations earlier, God had assured David that his throne would receive establishment eternally. At the time Isaiah was prophesying, that assurance appeared uncertain. The nation was declining. Foreign authorities jeopardized. The royal lineage appeared weak. However, God had not abandoned his assurance. This offspring would occupy on David's throne, not temporarily, yet eternally. He would arrange and establish the nation with judgment and fairness. These were not merely pleasant-sounding expressions. Judgment signified he would create correct determinations, governing with comprehension and equity. Fairness signified he would treat individuals correctly, providing everyone what they deserved, shielding the defenseless and punishing wrongdoing. And this would not persist for merely a lifetime or even a limited number of generations. It would persist from that time, advancing, even eternally. This represented a nation with no expiration indication, an administration with no conclusion, a lineage that would never collapse. The passage concludes with an essential statement. The passionate dedication of the Lord of hosts will execute this. How could Isaiah remain so certain this would transpire? How could he assure an eternal nation when every other nation in historical documentation had collapsed? Because this was not depending on mortal power or political capability. The passionate dedication, the passionate commitment, the overwhelming dedication of the Lord of hosts would accomplish it. God himself would ensure this prophecy arrived genuine. Afterward in his service, Isaiah received another vision regarding the arriving Messiah, and this individual employed distinct imagery. Rather than discussing regarding an offspring receiving birth, it discussed regarding a tree that appeared deceased, yet would return to existence. Isaiah chapter 11 verse 1 describes what Isaiah witnessed. "Present shall arrive forth a branch from the base of Jesse, and a shoot shall develop outward of his roots." Jesse represented David's parent. Consequently, discussing regarding Jesse's base represented another method of discussing regarding David's family lineage. However, why describe it as a base and roots rather than a thriving tree? Because by the time this prophecy would receive fulfillment, David's royal lineage would appear similar to it had received cutting downward. The nation would collapse. The monarchy would conclude. Foreign authorities would conquer Jerusalem. The descendants of David would lose their throne. From the exterior, it would appear similar to God's assurance to David had collapsed, similar to the family tree had received chopping downward and was deceased. However, Isaiah perceived something others might overlook. Although when a tree receives cutting downward, the roots persist underground, and from those roots, from that base that appears deceased, a new growth can develop. A shoot can emerge and transform into a new tree. That represents what would transpire with David's family. When the nation appeared concluded, when the royal lineage appeared extinct, a new growth would emerge, the Messiah developing from the ancient roots of Jesse and David. Verse 2 describes what would settle on this shoot. The Spirit of the Lord shall settle upon him, the spirit of comprehension and discernment, the spirit of counsel and authority, the spirit of understanding and of the reverence of the Lord. The Spirit of God would settle on him permanently, not arriving and departing similar to it accomplished with the decision-makers or the prophets, yet settling, establishing, persisting, remaining, and this Spirit would deliver particular qualities. Comprehension, the capacity to create the correct selections. Discernment, the ability to grasp what others overlook. Counsel, insight, to direct and guide. Authority, power to accomplish what requires accomplishment. Understanding, deep consciousness and perception. Reverence of the Lord, proper respect and regard for God. This shoot from Jesse's root would receive occupation with God's Spirit in all manners conceivable. He would possess everything required to govern flawlessly. Isaiah persisted, describing how this Spirit-occupied shoot would govern, and it would prove thoroughly distinct from how earthly decision-makers and monarchs functioned. Verse 3 commences, "His satisfaction exists in the reverence of the Lord, and he shall not evaluate by the observation of his vision, neither determine by the listening of his hearing capacity." Most decision-makers determine situations based on what they observe and listen to. They observe witnesses, they listen to testimonies, they examine evidence. However, this decision-maker would function distinctly. He would not receive restriction to external observations. He would not receive deception by appearances or influence by smooth communication. Verse 4 explains how he would evaluate. "Yet with righteousness he shall evaluate the vulnerable, and determine with equity for the humble of the earthly realm." The vulnerable and humble, the individuals who typically receive disregard or exploitation in mortal legal proceedings, would receive righteous evaluation from this monarch. He would treat them equitably, providing them fairness, ensuring they acquired fairness although they possessed no resources or authority. The passage persists with representations of his authority in evaluation. He shall strike the earthly realm with the controlling instrument of his speech, and with the exhalation of his speech he shall eliminate the evil. His expressions would prove powerful sufficiently to strike the earthly realm. His exhalation would prove sufficient to overcome the evil. He would not require military forces or weapons. Merely his expression would prove adequate to implement evaluation. Verse 5 describes his nature. "Righteousness shall represent the fastening of his middle region, and dedication the fastening of his waist portion." In ancient occasions, individuals wore extended garments, and they would secure them into their fastenings when they required to labor or engage in combat. The fastening maintained everything together. Isaiah was stating that righteousness and dedication existed so substantially a portion of this monarch that they resembled the fastening that maintained his complete nature together. Everything regarding him would receive marking by righteousness and dedication. Subsequently, Isaiah's vision expanded to demonstrate what the reality would appear similar to under this monarch's administration. The alterations would not prove merely political or spiritual, they would extend to all of creation. Verse 6 paints an exceptional representation. "The predatory canine additionally shall reside with the young sheep. The spotted feline shall recline downward with the young domesticated animal. The young bovine and the young large feline and the fattened creature together, and a small offspring shall guide them." Creatures that represent natural adversaries would exist together in harmony. Hunters and victims would recline downward alongside each other, and a small offspring would prove secure, guiding them. No fear, no jeopardy. Verse 7 persists. "The bovine and the large creature shall consume vegetation. Their young individuals shall recline downward together, and the large feline shall consume plant material similar to the bovine." Although the consumption patterns of creatures would alter, the large feline, a meat consumer, would consume plant materials similar to a peaceful bovine. The large creature, typically dangerous, would consume vegetation peacefully alongside bovines. Their young would recline downward together without any jeopardy. Verse 8 demonstrates how thorough this harmony would prove. The nursing offspring shall participate by the venomous serpent's opening, and the separated offspring shall position his hand in the poisonous serpent's dwelling. Although the most dangerous creatures, venomous serpents that can eliminate with one strike, would prove secure around offspring. Infants could participate near venomous serpent openings. Young children could position their hands into poisonous serpent dwellings. No jeopardy would exist whatsoever. Verse 9 explains why. They shall not damage, neither destroy, in all my holy elevated territory. For the earthly realm shall prove occupied of the understanding of the Lord, as the waters cover the oceanic body. The justification for this universal harmony is that the understanding of the Lord would occupy the earthly realm thoroughly. Exactly as water covers all portions of the oceanic floor, with no dry locations anywhere, the understanding of God would cover the complete earthly realm. When everyone genuinely understands God, when His manifestation occupies everything, no space exists for violence or devastation. This represented Isaiah's vision of the nation the Messiah would deliver. Not merely an improved political structure, not merely reformed regulations, yet a thorough conversion of reality itself. The negative condition that arrived into the reality through wrongdoing would receive reversal. Creation would return to the accord it possessed in the beginning. Harmony would dominate everywhere. And it would all transpire because of this offspring who would receive birth, this shoot who would develop from Jesse's root, this monarch who would govern with flawless righteousness eternally. If this narrative affected you, if Isaiah's extraordinary journey from the temple vision to these messianic prophecies revealed to your understanding something profound, do not maintain it to yourself. Subscribe to remain linked with additional biblical narratives that disclose God's strategy throughout historical documentation. Distribute this presentation with someone who requires to listen regarding the optimism Isaiah proclaimed, the optimism of an arriving monarch whose governing authority and harmony would never conclude. The narrative of redemption did not conclude with Isaiah. It was solely commencing. And you represent a portion of that persisting narrative.